Hey, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us during an incredibly busy time of term for this next installment of the CACR Speaker Series. We're very happy to be co-sponsoring this particular event today between CACR and the Ostrom Workshop. And I've had the privilege, of course, being associated with both institutions for some time now as a fellow at CACR and as the executive director of the Ostrom Workshop for the last year and a half or so. So it's a pleasure to have you all join us, and we're thrilled to be joined by Eli Sugarman today in this special discussion of the content oversight board. So we'll be teeing up Eli in just a moment. As a quick reminder for how the discussion is going to go, Eli will have a chance, of course, to provide opening remarks. Our very own Angie Raymond, also at the workshop and at the Kelly School, will be handling the Q&A to follow. And then we'll be closing things at 1 o'clock into the formal talk anyway, but you're welcome to stay on unless you have another obligation to continue the discussion then. So we should have plenty of time for questions. I'm sure there's going to be plenty. I'm looking forward to that. But first, let me properly introduce Eli Sugarman. Thank you so much again for joining us, Eli, who is the Director of Content at the Oversight Board, where Eli oversees the Oversight Board's case operations and associated teams, including case selection, case development, policy and research, case decisions, implementation, and monitoring. In that role, he advises and supports board members in their deliberations, decision-making, and formulation of policy recommendations. His team supports the board's core content moderation and free expression work. Previously, Eli was director of the cyber initiative at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. There, he led a 10-year, $130 million grant-making effort to build a more robust cybersecurity field and improve policymaking. And as recipients of a Hewlett grant, we're very thankful for your work and leadership on that, Eli. Earlier in his career, he was consultant and strategist to private sector and nonprofit leaders. From 2009 to 2014, Eli was senior director at an emerging markets advisory firm based in Washington, D.C., where he provided strategic counsel on international policy, regulatory, and business matters to clients globally. He served as a foreign affairs officer at the U.S. Department of State, where he focused on international security issues as well. Eli also serves these days on the executive board of the Cyber Peace Institute, the independent advisory committee of the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, and of course, the Ostrom Workshop's External Advisory Board. And we're very thankful for your service there. A San Diego native and graduate of Middlebury College, he holds a JD from Stanford University Law School. So Eli, we're just thrilled to have you to take part in this series and look forward to your opening remarks here and the questions to follow.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Scott, and thank you to Indiana University, the Center for Applied Cybersecurity Research, and the Ostrom Workshop for inviting me to give this talk today. And just to let everybody know that Scott and I, in addition to having funded IU, Scott and I went to law school together. And so if you want stories about Scott before he was an accomplished professor, like, I'm your man, just come to me, and I'm happy to dish. And so I guess sort of at the risk of perhaps losing at least part of the audience, I should probably let you know that I was indoctrinated from a young age to be a Michigan fan, but hopefully that won't cause too many problems. I'm trying to sort of wear IU colors, but they're also sort of Ohio State colors. And so, like, hopefully that doesn't set us off on the wrong foot, but just wanted to call that out sort of at the outset, because I thought maize and blue would be a bit too aggressive for the talk today. So with that, just to say, like, I'm really excited to talk today about the Oversight Board, where I've had the pleasure of working and leading the teams that really focus on our core content moderation and human rights work. I think you'll notice that I'm going to use the phrase Facebook to refer to the company at issue here. It's now rebranded as Meta. I'm just going to stick with Facebook because that's clearer. And what I'm talking about oftentimes happened over the past year before that Meta name change happened. But just like in all the board's decisions, we now have to clarify even what company it is we're talking about. So fun times there. And so just sort of a couple data points to sort of help frame the conversation. The board was created in 2020 to help Facebook answer some of the most difficult questions regarding online speech. Over the past year, it's really grown as an institution. It started issuing binding decisions and also non-binding policy recommendations. And so we'll get into some of those. In doing so, the board has encountered many challenges and opportunities, some foreseen, others not. And those are really, I think, worthy of reflection and what I want to focus on here today. I think exploring these lessons learned will really help identify some of the promising avenues to uphold human rights in the digital age, as well as some of those areas of ongoing concern that really require further scholarly study and discussion. So 1 year ago, October of 2020, the board started accepting appeals from Facebook and Instagram users around the world. So that meant for the first time, people could ask an outside body to examine Facebook's decisions about their content, should the post come down or stay back up, and provide a critical independent check on the company's decisions. Since then, the board has taken on roughly 24 difficult and important cases and issued roughly 18 decisions on topics as wide-ranging as hate speech to COVID-19 misinformation. In some important decisions, the board upheld Facebook, right? So sometimes Facebook does the right thing. So a good example of that is in one case, the board sided with Facebook in prohibiting a video that depicted a cultural tradition shared by many Dutch people without apparent racist intent, wherein white people wear blackface to depict the Zwarte Piet character. So since August of 2020, Facebook has explicitly prohibited caricatures of Black people in the form of blackface as part of its hate speech community standard. So the board found that Facebook, had made it sufficiently clear to users that that was what the rule was, and that blackface would be removed unless people were condemning blackface, and you needed to show it to condemn it and raise awareness. And so basically to say that in doing so, the board said that prohibiting blackface is in line with international human rights standards. That may appear obvious to some, but actually had never really been addressed before, and in the way that we did. And so it was a really significant decision, because if we had reversed Facebook, it basically would have ordered them to reinstate blackface and allow all sorts of blackface and racist content on the platform. And so just to say that sometimes Facebook does the right thing, and we need to validate that. But in other cases, the board overruled Facebook because Facebook didn't do the right thing. And so an example there is there's an interesting case where there was a comment from a supporter of imprisoned Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny, where that person had called another user a cowardly bot in the context of arguing about protests that were happening in Russia. And the board found that Facebook correctly applied its bullying and harassment community standard, that is, calling somebody a cowardly bot was sort of bullying and harassment, but that standard was unnecessary and disproportionate under international law because it restricted free expression. It also wasn't in line with Facebook's values. So all to say that Facebook needed to basically keep that post up, given the social and political context in Russia and the protests against the less than democratic government there. And so to say, there are many examples where we've overruled Facebook. In the past year, we've also received more than 10,000 public comments from people across the world. We've also made more than 75 policy recommendations to Facebook about all aspects of their products, their policies, everything in between. I'd say public comments from individuals and organizations across the world are incredibly valuable, and board members really grapple with them and really draw on them when they make their decisions. We've also accepted 2 requests for policy advisory opinions from Facebook. These are basically efforts where Facebook says, help us redraw a line, redraw an entire policy, one on private residential information and one to overhaul their cross-check system, which flags posts from users for additional review before enforcing them. This has gotten a lot of news coverage of late as a potential whitelist for politically connected people. We can talk about that more later if you'd like. We've also expanded our scope in the last year. So users now can obviously appeal when their content's taken down, say put it back up. They can also appeal to remove any post or any singular piece of content they see on Facebook anywhere in the world. And so that's a major growth and expansion. There'll be new growth and new expansion of our scope too in 2022. So stay tuned for that. And then sort of the last thing I think that's worth noting for what we've done over the past year is we issued our first quarterly transparency report. And that contains some really good details on the number of cases, where they come from, what community standards. So what's the issue in those cases? Is it dangerous individuals? Is it hate speech? What is it? How we select cases, how we filter them, sort of how the public comments process has worked, and also questions that we've asked of Facebook and whether they've responded or not. Hint, they don't always respond. And then we've also shared a lot of transparent information about Facebook's responses to the policy recommendations and the impact they're having. So those are some of the major milestones, I would argue, that we've achieved over the past year, just to sort of, give you a couple sort of concrete examples of what we've been up to. So shifting now to some of the lessons we've learned, right? As you would expect, there are all sorts of them. I'm going to focus on a couple key buckets just to try to stay focused, but want the Q&A to be as wide ranging as you would like. So as you'd expect, we've learned a lot over the past year. We're doing some exciting work, but it's also, a very challenging experiment. Some of the challenges we've faced were expected and others weren't. But so too were the opportunities that came along, right? And so some are the ones we'd hoped for and others have surprised us. I'd say sort of against the backdrop of what I'm going to get into, it's just worth thinking about, we say we're a startup, which we are in the sense that this is a new, messy experiment. But we're not the startup in the sense of a traditional small company, right? There was never a stealth mode. We were always we were birthed into this world with under a microscope, with somewhat unreasonable expectations, to solve a really thorny, messy problem. And I think that over time, we've realized that some of the structural challenges of just time zones, various languages, different disciplines, all of these issues that you sort of notionally would think of make the work hard, really do. And at the end of the day, it's really a human enterprise. And so I would say the staff and the board members have really gone above and beyond to try to make this experiment work. And a lot of what I'm going to describe comes from all of their hard work, sort of trying to help the institution succeed. So the first sort of bucket of lessons learned, I would say, is roughly what I'm calling it as users deserve better. Right. So many of you can likely relate to the experience of having their content removed from Facebook, or having your account restricted, or a family member's account restricted, with little explanation of why that happened and what you did wrong. Right. And it's not a fun experience because you're essentially then in Facebook jail. And being in Facebook jail hurts your ability to express yourself. Right. And so this is a common occurrence. We get inundated with messages from folks saying, help me. I don't know what happened to my account. I don't know how to get it back. There's no phone number to call at Facebook. There's no customer service. And so just to say, you probably expect that is sort of what we're on the receiving end of in certain respects. And so given the frequent and frantic messages the board receives from users, we really do treat as our North Star, making sure users are treated better and have their freedom of expression and other human rights respected by Facebook. So it's no surprise then in our early cases, a clear theme emerged. Facebook isn't being clear with the people who use its platform. We've consistently seen users left guessing about why Facebook removed their content and why content that users thought should come down was left up. I say this not to take a pot shot at Facebook, which does have among the most detailed, clear, and thoughtful rules, its community standards, of really any major platform. Facebook does deserve credit for that, but it still has a long way to go. And so just to sort of give you something a little more specific, and in one of our first cases, Facebook removed a user's content, but didn't tell them which community standard they'd broken. In another, Facebook didn't review a user's appeal before they came to the board. And then in another case, Facebook said a user broke its rules on dangerous individuals, which is basically, terrorist folks associated with an organization that's dedicated to a violent end and causes violence in the real world, but then found that Facebook had lost a policy exception for 3 years that allowed that user's post. So that's actually one of my favorite cases. And so sort of like the 3 sentences on that is, Abdullah Öcalan was the founder of the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which is a designated foreign terrorist organization in the United States and elsewhere. And so a user had posted commenting on how he is confined in Turkey, right? Solitary confinement, is it cruel and unusual, so on and so forth. And the post came down. And that surprised us because you should be able to comment on people's confinement. That just sort of seems logical and also in line with human rights standards. And are you prohibited from discussing how people are held at Gitmo? Like, obviously not, right? Like that is not typically how Facebook operates. So as we dug into the case, we found out that Facebook had literally written the rule, you are allowed to comment on the terms of confinement of terrorist organizations and individuals, but then they lost that rule. And so there was no way when you're then enforcing on people's content to say, oh, should this then come down? Oh, there's an exception, it goes back up. They lost that for 4 years. And that was only discovered by virtue of this case. And is a really small example of the kinds of things that we've been able to do to help users be treated fairly, because now Facebook has found that, and now those kinds of posts are allowed. I'm sorry, I'll try not to go too into the weeds on random things throughout, but that is one of my favorite cases. So having received more than 750,000 appeals to date, we know that these cases are just the tip of the iceberg. Right now, it's clear that by not being clear and responsive enough with users, Facebook is not treating them in the way they deserve to be treated. On the flip side, I don't think we fully understood until more recently, how much help we would need from users to really help identify the best cases, the most difficult and important ones. By that, I mean that every individual's case and appeal matters to them. But selecting a small number of cases, right? I told you we've selected roughly 24 cases in a year. When we're selecting a small number of cases from hundreds of thousands, we have to be extremely thoughtful and strategic in picking cases that have the potential for broader impact. That's a challenge when you moderate content at scale, because a lot of the decisions, a lot of the cases are important to individuals, but really caring about a Jeffrey Dahmer meme is not like the same as having wide scale international human rights impact. And that is a real challenge that we're grappling with that I don't think we fully grasped at the outset of the organization. Another example that may actually be even more interesting to those in the Indiana community is we're still not seeing that many appeals to remove content, right? That is the scope expansion I referred to. Roughly only 1 in every 14 appeals asks the board to tell Facebook, take this down. All the other, the 13 are, you took my stuff down, put it back up, right? And so we expected more of these appeals to say, I saw this nasty thing, pull it down. Because literally anyone in the world can go report any content. If you're a friend of Scott's and you see him posting offensive material praising Michigan or whatever, you can report that, right? But people aren't doing that. And so we don't really understand why that is, because we expected that civil society organizations and activists and researchers would appeal in a coordinated manner to bring timely and important issues to the board's attention. I honestly don't fully know why this isn't happening, but it's a signal that there's quite a bit of untapped potential there for the board's current scope, because if those appeals significantly increased, we'd have a huge array of really exciting cases to sink our teeth into. So just, again, something we did not expect that we've learned that I think is worth pointing out. Sort of the next bucket of lessons learned I want to move to is really just building off that, which is transparency is critical, which is sort of obvious. But the importance of our role in forcing Facebook to be transparent, again, I don't think we fully understood, but it's something we care deeply about. So transparency is another area where Facebook must urgently improve, and we want to be part of the solution. Our recommendations have repeatedly urged Facebook to just follow basic tenets of transparency. Make your rules easily accessible in your users' languages. Tell people as clearly as possible how you make and enforce your decisions. And where people break your rules, tell them exactly what they've done wrong. Since Facebook published its first responses to our recommendations earlier this year, we've already seen some early wins for user transparency. Sort of a quick list. In February, Facebook consolidated its existing policies on health misinformation in one place after we set its rules, mainly on COVID disinfo, were spread across many different websites. I can tell you from the amount of time that my staff spent trying to cobble together and track how different blogs and newsroom posts referenced earlier ones and changed a rule, but then didn't integrate it into the overarching rule set. It was a mess before they did this. And it's great that this is done, because now it's much easier to actually follow what are the rules on Facebook about COVID misinfo. Then in May, Facebook committed to translate its community standards into Punjabi, a language spoken by 130 million people by the end of the year, right? Again, basic thing that should have happened. Civil society had been calling for things like this, but the board was in a position to really channel that and make it happen. So that's another big one. In June, Facebook pledged to include its satire exception, which was previously not communicated to users, in its community standards by the end of the year. Again, this is an instance where you have the community standards, which are the public-facing rules. Underneath them, you have several really important rule sets that are not shared publicly. You have the implementation standards, the known questions, and then you have other lists like a slurs list, a dangerous individuals and organizations list. This is basically like secret rules or secret law, if you will, that we are trying to really bring into the light, because that's really what controls how do you apply this public rule in an instance is all of these other rules that you can't see. And so the fact that we could break out part of it in the satire exception and get it out in the public is important. There's still a lot more to do there. In August, Facebook agreed to provide information in its Transparency Center on content removed for violating its community standards, following a formal report by a government, and also the number of requests it receives from governments. This is a big issue about how Facebook and platforms reply to government requests, because there is a difference between, hey, this content is illegal under local law, take it down, versus, hey, we don't like this stuff critical of us, we're going to try to squeeze you and ask you to take it down informally, or hey, we think it violates your community standards, so can you sort of take another look and take it down under a community standard, even though it's not a formal government request. There's a lot of gray area in there that's really messy and problematic. And this is a first step to trying to like really get in there and help Facebook do better. In September, Facebook added information to its community standards on when content is eligible for fact checking, including whether public institutions are eligible. Again, a basic thing that you would want to know if you're actually trying to help ensure that fact checking is having the intended positive impact on content. And in October, Facebook said it would implement the board's recommendation to conduct an independent examination into whether its content moderation practices were applied without bias in Israel and Palestine. So again, here, as I think a lot of you know, in the recent uptick in violence between Israel and Palestine, there were repeated claims about over-censorship of Palestinian and sort of Arab communities in the way that Facebook was removing content. The board accepted a case related to that. And this was, of course, coming from one of the recommendations in that case. So those are some sort of specific examples. I think sort of coming back to how do you actually make this change happen at Facebook? I think you're sort of seeing the board repeatedly make recommendations that Facebook needs to be more transparent in general, including how it handles high-profile accounts, sort of on cross-check. But at the same time, you need to make sure all users are treated fairly. And so that's a challenge and a trade-off there. Independent oversight from the board and others is essential to ensuring safe and fair speech on Facebook. And I think you'll see going forward that we'll remain committed to enforcing accountability, consistency, and fairness throughout Facebook's content moderation processes. And I think that's also, you're going to see an ongoing focus on some of these lists and internal rules that I referred to that we have access to at the board, but that Facebook is not yet willing to fully share publicly. I think that's a really important area to continue to push on from a transparency perspective. I think sort of something there to acknowledge that you're probably thinking is it's great that we want to share these internal rules publicly, but how will adversaries potentially take advantage of that and game the system? And so this is an area that I'm sure you talk about in other lectures on cybersecurity, which is the adversarial nature of cybersecurity makes this more challenging. It's same to some degree with content moderation and bad actors, that the more you share about rules, the more transparent and open you are, the more information bad actors have, and the more they are able to manipulate and stay just close to the line, and then you have to move it, and then they game it again, so on and so forth. And so we're aware of those dynamics, but I still think there's a better way to be more transparent about how Facebook is making its rules, how it implements them, without incentivizing and empowering bad actors to game the system and win. But there is always going to be that back and forth there while you have bad actors trying to game the system. It's just a start, but we do think that the combined impact of our recommendations will push Facebook to be more transparent and benefit users. You'll see more of that in our forthcoming transparency report, our annual report. We're trying to get as much information out there as possible so that we can walk the walk, right? Like if we're constantly trying to hold Facebook to account for being more transparent, and then we don't do that, that's obviously antithetical to our values. And so I'd say stay tuned for those reports. And I would say if you also want an ongoing empirical look on what's happening at the board and transparent, there's actually a really good blog at Lawfare, the Facebook Oversight Board blog. I don't know if they're going to rename it the Meta Oversight Board blog, the mob, and play into that whole meme that Evelyn Duick and others, I think, quite aptly raised on Twitter and whatnot. But just to say, squeeze us, hold us accountable. If you want more information and we're not being transparent enough, come to me or others, because we want to improve and we really do want to walk the walk on transparency. Let me sort of, start winding down with just sort of an articulation of the path forward and some big questions that I think we're grappling with. So I think you can sort of sense from my energy and outlook that I'm excited for what the future holds for the board. We've achieved a lot in our first year and have even larger ambitions for the future. Drawing on the lessons learned to date, I think there are several key questions that we should focus on moving forward. First is what impacts are we hoping to achieve? We know we're working to make Facebook and Instagram a better place for users, where their rights are respected. But more concretely, what changes do we want to see on the platform? How will we accomplish those, and how will we measure our success? And that's an area where there's tons of opportunity for researchers, for stakeholders to really help say, like, these are the 5 changes the board should push for it at Facebook. We love top 5 and top 10 lists. Another question is, how do we reconcile context and precision versus scalability? And so what I mean there is there's a trade-off between hyper-contextualized decisions and the ability of any platform to scale implementation. So think about that Navalny case that I referenced, where Facebook had a standard rule on bullying and harassment that they applied correctly. The problem was, in our view, that it didn't take account of the context in Russia because of protests that were happening in St. Petersburg in the weeks preceding the post. That's a lot of context that's really hard to build into a system. And so there's a trade-off, right, between blunt instruments and that hyper-contextualized sort of scalpel. So where on the spectrum do we as the board want to sit, and where do we want Facebook to sit? That's a hard one to answer. How can we diversify and expand user and stakeholder engagement? So right now we receive many more cases and appeals from North America. We receive many more appeals. We purposely pick a geographically diverse set of cases, but we receive many more appeals from North America and Europe than the rest of the world. Likewise, we receive the largest number of public comments from those regions too. How do we make progress encouraging even more users from the global south to engage and appeal to the board? And so part of it, of course, is awareness. Part of it is being accessible in other languages, but we need to do more there. And so again, that's, I think, a big area for us to push into. Next is, how can we refine and enhance the tools and the levers of power to achieve the change that we want, right? Like the current tools in our toolkit, right? We have various tools, from binding decisions to non-binding policy recommendations to blog posts to talks like this. How should we utilize those to have maximum effect? Should we emphasize hearing more cases? Should we do more policy advisory opinions? Both, things that we still need to do. How do we clarify the meaning of my favorite acronym, ICPC, identical content in parallel contexts? And so when we issue a binding decision, Facebook has 7 days to do what we order them to do, reinstate the content or take it down. Similarly, they then have to do that same action on all identical content in parallel contexts. What exactly that means is still sort of, evolving. And so, how do we clarify that definition to make sure decisions have even more impact? 3 more questions that I have. One is, do we need new tools and resources? 1 year in, are there new powers and capabilities that the board needs? A perfect example of this is access to data that would enable the board to understand what's happening on Facebook, pick more impactful cases, and accurately measure changes and impacts on the platform. Access to that data is critical for us and any actor seeking to hold Facebook to account. That is obviously a key theme in all the whistleblower revelations, some of the attempted but failed partnerships to get data for academics. We need that information too, because right now Facebook is a black box, largely speaking, and there needs to be a way to get the data, interrogate it, and hold Facebook to account. So that's an area that we're really, obviously thinking hard about, drawing on the work of others that have come before us. Another question, what does growth mean? One obvious form of growth is growing the board's scope and mandate over Facebook products and services. So do we expand to Facebook accounts, groups, ads? Like where do we go next, right? I'm excited by some of the news that we'll share next year on those plans. But growth could also mean expanding the companies beyond Facebook. Should that be part of the board's ambition? The trust that funds us specifically contemplates having other revenue streams. Like, is that the sort of thing that we should be focused on? It's a really important question. And then last question is, how can the board help ensure that the metaverse avoids the pitfalls of Facebook? And I chuckle every time I have to read the word metaverse. Free expression and content moderation challenges in virtual reality are fascinating, complex, novel, and really, really important. How can the board help Meta design policies and enforcement frameworks that protect international human rights from the outset? And that's something that I think is really top of mind given recent announcements. So I know I've thrown a lot of information your way, and apologize if some of it's in the weeds and I rambled on tangents about cases that I like a lot. But I hope at least some of it captured your imagination and will spark a lively Q&A. Just to say thank you again for this opportunity, for indulging me as I probably rambled a bit about the oversight board, but really just appreciate the opportunity and look forward to your questions. And I will stop there.
Hello, everyone. The queue is open. You can raise your hands, or I'm also keeping track of the chat. And I'll always take the opportunity if someone doesn't speak first. So feel free to jump in.
Looks like Asif.
I'm gonna defer to Joseph because he raised his hand and he's here. So go for it.
So thank you, Eli, for being here today. The transparency question, and I haven't followed this closely, so maybe there's been statements on it, but the opinions are anonymous, correct, by the oversight board? And I'm curious. Correct. I'm curious Correct. About the rationale behind that, and if that's a transparency thing that's under consideration to make them non-anonymous opinions. Thank you.
Yeah, no, great question. So the decision there to make them anonymous, I think at the first level, it's to protect some of the board members. As some of you know, I think some of them are based in parts of the world where they are at risk and literally have physical security as a result of that. And so if one were to put their names on it, we thought that would bring risk to them. I think there's also sort of a collaborative dynamic that's trying to be fostered through sort of collaborative decision making. And given this was an experiment, I think the decision was that if you make it clear that the board sort of signs the decision, right, but it's really the panel of 5 board members that are assigned to it that drive it. And so the thinking was that if you have the panel really empowered to do that, if you keep it anonymous, it can send a cleaner signal, as opposed to then getting into the politics of, okay, these 7 board members typically have this view and cluster on decisions in this way. And then you lapse into sort of the discussion we often get just about the US Supreme Court, right? About the quote unquote conservative and the quote unquote liberal justices. And I think that was a sort of secondary or tertiary point. I do think it's fair though, especially as the board expands, as we settle in, as we perhaps think through some of these security and other dynamics, does the board need to reconsider that? But right now that anonymity of board members is something I think the board is still quite wants to prioritize until perhaps things settle a bit. But I think it's a really good point and a really fair question.
So thank you so much, Eli, for a great presentation. I'd be curious if you could expand a little beyond the nitty-gritty of the work of the oversight board within Facebook and kind of think more philosophically about the creation of an oversight board in a corporation in this vein, and whether or not other corporations who have not followed suit should do the same. And should this become the model by which we engage in content moderation?
Yeah, no, that's one of my favorite questions. So thank you for asking it. So I think it depends, right? I think different companies are differently situated, have different values, and have different risk appetites. So I would say it is one model that other companies should seriously consider. I think what we're hoping to see is others emulate the board, right? To say, hey, we think you did these 3 things right, you missed on these 2 things, so we're gonna, conceptualize it slightly differently, but it, looks like a sibling of sorts. It would be nice, perhaps if companies were like, you know what, you're doing a good enough job, we like the structure, we want your team to help advise us, and so we want to partner in some way directly. I think there are also going to be other experiments that are all sorts of different flavors of what self-governance, non-governmental grievance mechanisms, whatever terminology you want to use. I think we're at the stage of evolution where you need to see a range of different flavors, if you will, and then we need some time to see what works best in different contexts. And it may be that certain, there may be regional differences, there may be differences in scale, in terms of size of platform, there may be differences in the kind of technology and the platform it is. Is there a difference between what traditional Facebook does and what, say, the metaverse does, distinguishing between sort of reality and virtual reality, or augmented reality, or, audio content, which is a whole different bucket of content moderation challenge. So just to say, I think I'm in favor of experimentation, and I wouldn't say the board is the one size solution for everybody, but I do think it's a very important experiment because it touches one of the biggest platforms on earth that has billions of users. It's reasonably well resourced, and I think it applying international human rights law in this way is not how human rights law was intended to be applied, but it really does resonate in certain ways because you don't really have another globally legitimate rule set that can be consistently applied. That's not to say there aren't huge issues and challenges with it, but I think just sort of as an initial way to address that question of like, well, do you have different rules in the US and India, or do you have the same rules, right? That's a really thorny one that any system like this has to get at. So I guess I'm in favor of other experiments too, while those who want to copy your partner have freedom to do that. So I don't know, maybe a slightly rambling answer, but I think there's still a lot of potential to join, to follow, and to even do things differently.
Just a quick follow-up related to that. So if you found in any of your decisions, either made or broader research around content moderation decisions by Facebook, that any of that had an interoperability with what happened in the broader universe of communications outside of Facebook, and whether or not the decisions of other companies impacted yours and vice versa?
Yeah, so I would say that when we're researching cases and preparing case files for a panel, right, there are several inputs into that. One is public comments, which are really important, and those do draw on, well, Twitter's doing this differently, or, you know, Google's doing it differently. Why doesn't Facebook copy them or whatnot? We do have, you know, expert vendors who are scholars and experts, and they provide analysis that can be comparative as well. We obviously follow what's happening on other, but there isn't sort of a formal mechanism to say, is Facebook doing best practice and following or diverging from what other similarly situated platforms are doing? But there are definitely channels for where that information and experience of others can then influence and be drawn upon. So I do think that happens a bit informally and organically, as I've described. I think a goal and something we're looking to do and we're hoping will happen is that the decisions will be clear enough, accessible enough, and relevant enough for other platforms and adjudicatory bodies to cite and to use them in different ways. You know, I think, you know, we'll see if any day some regulatory body in some other country or a court sort of uses them and cites to them, not as sort of, you know, persuasive authority or whatever the right standard is. So I do think that will happen. I think that will be neat when it does. And then it'll be interesting to see how we respond once it does. I think, you know, you may also be seeing, you know, soon our decisions being made available in certain repositories where those kinds of judicial decisions are typically held and made available to researchers and lawyers and scholars. So, yeah.
So we have a question in chat, and I know you all can see the question, but for the purpose of the recording, I need to read this. Recently, the NOYB organization run by Max Scherms has given its opinion on the Irish data protection authorities, wherein Facebook's processing of personal data for advertising and marketing purposes bypassed the consent requirement under the GDPR and relied rather on performance of a contract as the legal basis on which they can process the data. Now, many authorities within the EU provide that this is not allowed and contrary to what is stipulated in the GDPR. Yet the Irish authorities' decision on the matter shows that Facebook is not doing anything awful here, but just needs to be transparent to users about the legal basis they rely upon for the processing. So my question is this: are other social media platforms other than Facebook tending to bypass stringent requirements for processing personal data?
So it's a great question, and I apologize that I'm going to have to say I'm not the right person to answer it, because Facebook's processing of user data is something that really they're best suited to comment on. And I don't have the kind of knowledge I would need of Google, Twitter, or other platforms and how they handle user data to comment in an intelligent way. But you know, great question. Just sorry that I'm not the best suited to answer it.
Jadi?
So thank you for your talk. And I actually had a related question to the one asked before. So Facebook has all of these different services like third-party applications, and now it also like connects to Instagram and WhatsApp and whatnot. So when the oversight board makes recommendations and thinks about policy, like what is the level of like policy recommendation that you come up with?
Yeah, no, so it's a great question. And the answer is it sort of varies. So right now our scope is Facebook and Instagram. So WhatsApp, for instance, is out of scope. So when we issue a policy recommendation saying you need to do X to notify a user or whatever the recommendation is, that does not apply to WhatsApp unless Facebook decides to broaden what we have asked them or recommended to do, because WhatsApp is not included in our scope per our founding documents. Part of the conversation with Facebook, though, is how do we expand that scope and bring new products and services in scope? And so that is an active conversation, and that will continue to happen. So I don't know when or if WhatsApp will ever come into scope, but some of those other products and services definitely will. And so when we issue a recommendation, we can say, we want you to do X in this language across all of sort of, Facebook posts and sort of Instagram, or we can say, as it pertains to just like this narrow part of it, we want you to do it. So we can sort of control the level a little bit in those recommendations. They are non-binding. And so Facebook, basically the way it works is we issue them in the opinion. Facebook is then required within 30 days to respond publicly saying, we've agreed to it, we're considering it, or no, and offer a reason, basically. And they publish a quarterly report that summarizes what they're doing to then follow up after they've then done that 30-day sort of initial basically comment on what they're going to do. And so it's an interesting vehicle. I think that's another area to pay attention to that I think is an evolution, that we're now learning what's working and what's not. And so I think in the coming months, you'll also see that we're probably going to evolve that process a little bit to make it even more impactful and a little bit cleaner, so that we can help Facebook turn the dial the way that the board thinks it should be turned.
Queue is open. I have a question. If no one's going to jump in, my question is, how are you all structured so that you ensure the current people on the oversight board aren't quickly replaced by the evildoers that we don't want on the oversight board?
Who are the evildoers? Is one of them named Shackelford? No. So no, I'm
trying to be super general, but what can imagine?
I kid.
It sounds
so,
like you're being very articulate, very legal, very respectful of human rights and all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
But one can imagine this going. You have a lot of power,
for sure,
and a lot of connections, and one can imagine this being.
No, it's a great question. So sort of how do we ensure our independence in various ways is sort of the overarching theme, which is an absolutely critical one. So the way it worked was, in the first instance, Facebook chose the 4 co-chairs, right? So we have 20 board members from around the world, former prime minister, judges, journalists, human rights defenders, so on and so forth. The 4 co-chairs then worked with Facebook to appoint the other 16 to create the current 20 cohort, right? We've since, and so basically the way it worked is that first tranche was Facebook appointed, even though the co-chairs really helped drive it to make sure that it's a very independent group, many of whom are extremely critical of Facebook, if you've seen their background and their public comments. We're now in the phase of, that was the initial phase. Now, in the next phase of expansion, it's a joint process where the board members themselves and Facebook negotiate and jointly agree on any new board members who are appointed. The trust has to sign off on it, but it's basically the existing board members led by the co-chairs and Facebook jointly agree. So nobody can be appointed. Some evildoer, hypothetically in this scenario, can be appointed without the current board members agreeing to that. And then once that next expansion happens, which is somewhere up to 20 members as envisioned in the charter and bylaws, after that, any change in board members, people rolling off, rolling on, retiring, what have you, fully at the discretion of the board. Facebook no longer has any role at that point in nominating, choosing, or selecting board members at that point. So there's basically a 3-stage process to sort of get it launched. Now we're in the sort of training wheels, if you will, and then full independent appointment of board members. And so, there are some real safeguards there. Then there are other checks where the trust is independent of Facebook, and they are really like the sword and the shield, right? So if there's a problem with independence, like they are there to go defend the board members, the staff from Facebook, and sort of like, be the block. So there are other layers and other safeguards that are enshrined in the agreements, but the board members, I think you're right, is sort of, you put your finger on the key one.
Just had a really quick one as well, Eli. You had mentioned that you were a bit surprised that there weren't more appeals, happening. Or sorry if I maybe mischaracterized that, but that maybe they weren't just taking off quite as quickly as maybe some had expected. And I'm wondering, is there any outreach happening? Are you guys trying to do anything to change that dynamic?
So we're getting, I think, a really healthy amount of appeals to reinstate content, right? So the original kind of appeal, your post is taken down, you feel strongly because you're like, put my stuff back up, like put it back up. And so we get a lot of those appeals, vast majority of the roughly 4,000 appeals a day are that. We get a trickle, right? It's like low digit hundreds per day of this other kind, which is, hey, I've seen something nasty on the platform, take it down. So they appeal to remove content. So we're not doing a overt outreach encouraging people to submit those appeals or coordinate them. We do events, we have newsletters, we do a lot of engagement in general. And Rachel, my colleague who helps lead that team, is on the call, and they do amazing work around the globe. We haven't called out precisely that, hey, come engage in a coordinated appeal and pursue your advocacy agenda by appealing to us. We may do that more overtly, but it's always an area that is open to, interested scholars, students, civil society groups to do that. I mean, I figured there'd be groups just waiting for like, I know this like piece of content, white nationalist propaganda has been on the platform for 2 years and it hasn't come down, even though I've like tried to get Facebook to come down. Like, what if I were to get 20 groups to take it down? Or on the flip side, I see this post promoting, really nasty drug use or something, and I want to get my groups to sort of, appeal to take it. So I don't really know, but we're hoping those appeals take off, because I do think they're a really promising area to see where many different people and groups feel strongly about a similar issue and post, as opposed to when your post comes down as an individual, you can't actually share it with others, right? Like there isn't a way for you to then go get your neighbor to appeal with you, because like they can't see that your post, why it's come down, because they don't have access to your account, right? So there's also a structural design thing that allows you to do one at scale and one sort of more individually, if that makes sense.
No, super helpful. Thanks a lot.
Joseph?
So since there's not a lot of hands up, I'll go again. I have 3 questions, a potpourri, pick one of them, okay?
Great.
And I know that Asif has something. So one question is, does the oversight board have any role in trying to address election misinformation as we head into 2022 and 2024? That's one. The second question is, because these are anonymous decisions, can you give us a peek behind the curtain? Are there things that are really challenging from the different perspectives among the oversight board members? Like I could imagine free speech being one of those issues, depending on where somebody's from. And then the third one is the researchers that lost access to data. And do you guys have any role in that particular issue? And thank you, Eli. Just one is perfectly fine. I don't want to hog the time.
No, great questions. Yeah, on election misinfo, yes, to the extent that, anybody can appeal a decision saying, hey, this content was taken down because it constituted certain forms of misinformation. They can appeal that to us and we can agree to take it. I think there was a New York Times story, I don't know, a month or 2 ago about a potential election policy committee or something that Facebook was to create or not. I think, I don't exactly know what's going on there, but I think it stands to reason this is a high priority profile issue. So yeah, like that, those issues under the community standards, a lot of them are in scope for us. It's hard for me to pull back the veil, just given how sensitive the deliberative process is. But I think you identified an area that I think is probably one where yeah, I think an interesting question is, how do you stay true to international human rights while still taking into account the local context and local legal traditions, like the First Amendment, which may not be the same as free expression or international human rights law. I think there's some interesting issues there. On the researchers who lost access to data, we have not been involved there, but I do think some of the concerns that they have are similar concerns that we have about needing data and the public benefit of making it usable. But I do think that's an area I'm hoping we push into more. Yeah.
So I'm also just using the privilege that there's a lull in the questioning to indulge. So I'm really, again, before I ask you about the philosophy of the corporate governance structure, and I'm also curious about the philosophy of your jurisprudential frameworks. So I'm curious whether or not there was ever a conversation on the board about how are we going to engage in canons of interpretation and figuring out how we're interpreting our policy? Or why are we adopting human rights law, whatever that means, as a framework by which we analyze this? Are we bound by this law? So just like, how is the jurisprudential philosophy?
Sure. No, hey, listen, great question. The jurisprudential philosophy is still evolving, right? So I think it's fair to say that there are a couple big topics that the board members are actively grappling with and trying to sort of create what is that jurisprudential construct and have a sort of a common viewpoint so that there's consistency across decisions, right? And that there is a jurisprudence that holds together as opposed to just like goes in a million different directions and is not consistent, right? So, an example there is, what is the precedential value of decisions? Right? Like there's a whole range of questions like that are not clear from the charter or the bylaws because they rightly have been left to the board members to work that out. So I think what I would say there is there are really substantive, really meaty conversations that happen on an ongoing basis. And I think the question is, as the board becomes more comfortable and makes decisions about those, how does it share them externally? And I think we don't really have a clear plan yet as to how we share that. And because I think it's great. So yes, the board is grappling with all of those questions. There are a series of conversations and internal papers being prepared that work through all of those questions, right? And so it's a great flag and a very high priority for board members. So spot on. That's exactly what they're thinking about. As to the international human rights law sort of paradigm. That was a decision that was made during the design and creation of the board. It was not a decision of the board members themselves to impose that. What happened, as I understand, and this predates me, was there were multi-thousand person consultations held around the world for 18 months to try to figure out what should be the body of law that is applied by this institution. And I think that international human rights law was essentially what the vast majority of people consulted wanted, and some folks obviously didn't like that and viewed there were alternatives. I think the challenge is, how do you actually have a consistent rule set that isn't country by country or region by region? And that became sort of the guiding principle. It was sort of, we want to treat all users around the world fairly and in the same way, and therefore we need a globally applicable rule set. And the one that is the most legitimate, that sort of deals with the values that we want to enshrine, is international human rights law, despite its warts. It's written at this level, we need to apply it down here. There are all these issues with it. It's still the best alternative we have. And then the next point, I think, is how does it conflict with Facebook rules and values, and what is sort of like the precedential, like what governs if, to the extent there's a conflict? Right. Exactly. So I think what you've seen in the boards sort of has basically hinted at that, to the extent there's a conflict between Facebook's values and international human rights law controls. And we haven't had cases that have been as direct and really like gone there. I would expect we will at some point. But again, like that goes to the jurisprudential sort of construct.
But don't you see a problem by the fact that international human rights law isn't a monolith? That is
yes,
defined.
It is not a monolith. It is complex. It is an amalgam of all sorts of, and so right. So you're right, but I don't think there is any single global rule set that is a monolith that is relevant in this area, right? So for sure, it's messy. How do we deal with regional human rights treaties, constructs, sort of standards, and how do we integrate those? And so again, that's another one of these questions that the board is grappling with, and I would expect will come out in certain decisions in the future. But yeah, you're right. It's definitely not as clean and simple as I'm describing it in certain ways.
Thank you.
Yeah.
There are a couple questions in the chat, which I'm happy to read. Okay, I'll read one that seems a little bit different than the rest. There is one that George posts. Is there a ceiling on the amount of money the board members receive from the funding source for their participation? Is that amount received equal for all members?
So yes, so the board members are compensated because they are doing really, really hard work that is very time consuming. My understanding is all the board members are paid the same amount, although to be honest, I am not involved in that side of things. But given our emphasis on equity and consistency and fairness, that is my understanding. And that it's if someone, it increases at whatever rate per year, that sort of thing. I don't think there's a ceiling on it in the sense of some limitation. It's just what has been negotiated across everybody, what is budgeted for. It's more sort of how you would think of sort of a salary for an employee, as opposed to saying like, I don't think there are pay bands within it, but I could be wrong because I don't control it.
We have a couple minutes left. We probably have time for one more question, and the other questions in the chats mimic some other ones that have been asked. So does anybody have a question?
I might just ask the crystal ball question for Eli, if that's okay. Kind of looking ahead to the next, year, 3 years. Obviously, this is all so new, Eli. So it's a very opaque crystal ball. But I'd love to hear your thoughts from your unique perspective, wearing so many different hats over the last few years. And frankly, where you see, the board headed, right, in its evolution, and both in terms of priorities, interactions, obviously with Facebook, and if you see, frankly, if you've heard any rumors about other, platforms following here, right, with their own independent investigations and boards.
Yeah. So I think it's hard to tell, right? I think just riffing off, I like to draw parallels or dissimilarities between cybersecurity and content moderation. And I think you're seeing the content moderation community and industry, trust and safety, however you want to describe the community, evolve and come out of the shadows a bit in interesting ways that may parallel the way that sort of the cybersecurity community is, still not a monolith, but is at least, a bit more open, a bit more coherent and sort of than it has been in the past. I think you're going to see content moderation as a service and content moderation as a priority for companies just taking off, right? I think this is clear just as everybody tries to have a presence online, add new tools and applications, what you allow people to do and to say when you control where they are online is essentially content moderation, right? So everything is content moderation, to borrow from Evelyn Dueck. And so I think you're just going to see that take off. I think you're going to see government regulators continue to struggle with how to regulate or not, because certain things just can't be regulated well, I would argue, just given how quick, how messy they are. And you're going to continue to have this helter-skelter. Some governments say you have to take this down within 24 hours. But then if you take down stuff that shouldn't, we'll penalize you. And you're like, that's just not possible. You can't have a perfect content moderation system at scale. It just is impossible. And I think governments wanting something that's totally unattainable is going to create real problems for companies and will lead to fracture of some platforms. So I think the regulatory environment is going to remain extremely messy and fraught. It's going to be a hot mess, to be just totally honest.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No. I think you're going to see some platforms sort of try to find what is their new solution to that self-governance. What is something that they can do to help forestall regulation, or to just say like, we need help, whatever is motivating the decision to try to change the way that they are, moderating content. And does that mean an independent oversight board or not? I don't know. I think though that the one thing I'd say is like, I think content moderation as a service is just going to be a boom area, right? It's like, we're not going to develop all this stuff in house. So like, we'll buy all your tools and sort of your feeds and then rely on your analysis of signals. And whether it's a cloud provider that offers that, and you're going to use all of AWS's offerings because they host you, I don't know. But I do think you're going to see all these interesting questions that are also then going to go, where does content moderation move up and down the stack, right? Because we're focused on a certain layer right now. I think the really hard, the even harder stuff is, what about CDNs like Cloudflare? How do we think about there? How do we think about, cloud providers and their hosting? And as you think about groups that engage in violence, fundraising and doing other things, those companies are not going to be able to remain as, I don't want to say they're inactive, because some of them are proactive, but if you look at, say, like their policies, it's like a 6 bullet pointed single page, as opposed to like just hundreds of pages on a Facebook or a Google. So I think you're going to see the different layers of the stack really coming into play in interesting ways, and that's going to become part of the conversation even more than it is now.
Well, it's 1 o'clock, so I want to be respectful of people's time. Eli, I want to tell you how much we appreciate you taking time out of your day. This is a really fascinating talk. And Scott and Angie, thank you for hosting. And then finally, I just want to say to everybody, this is our last CACR talk for the calendar year of 2021, but we'll be back on January 27th with another wonderful speaker, Jonathan Mayer, who is a JD PhD at Princeton's Department of Computer Science. So we hope to see you all again in January and hope you guys have a wonderful weekend. Eli, thank you again so much.
Thanks for having me.
Really well done, Eli. And I'm